In her 1932 memoir, The Fun of It, Amelia Earhart wrote, "Flying may not be all plain sailing, but the fun of it is worth the price." For Earhart, on her second attempt to become the first female pilot to circumnavigate the globe, the price was her life. Born in the landlocked state of Kansas to Samuel and Amy Earhart, Amelia was the second child of the family after a stillborn infant the year prior. For a girl born in the late 1890s, her upbringing was anything but the norm. Amelia's mother did not believe into molding her children into what she called nice little girls. Amelia and her younger sister developed an early sense of adventure, with the girls departing their home almost daily to explore the neighborhood. They spent much of their young life doing things atypical to girls in the Edwardian era, such as climbing trees, hunting rats with rifles, and keeping a large array of bugs in a collection. Many biographers have categorized Earhart as a stereotypical tomboy. It was in Iowa that Amelia saw her first aircraft. She was unimpressed by the flying machine and even described the biplane as a thing of rusty wire and wood and not at all interesting. As World War I began, Amelia found herself as a nurse trained by the Red Cross and began working with the Voluntary Aid Detachment at a military hospital. When the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 erupted, Amelia continued in her arduous nursing duties, which eventually caused her to become a patient herself, suffering from pneumonia and maxillary sinusitis. After her recovery, Amelia had her newest encounter with an aircraft with a friend at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. A World War I ace who was flying overhead spotted Amelia and her friend in a clearing and dived his plane at them. "I am sure," he said to himself, "watch me make them scamper," Amelia said. But she stood her ground as the plane came exceedingly close to them. "I did not understand it at the time," she said, "but I believe that little red plane said something to me as it swished by." A few years later, Amelia took her first flight from pilot Frank Hawks. "By the time I had gotten 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly." After that $10, 10-minute flight, Amelia was determined to learn to fly herself. She put all of her time and energy into accumulating the $1,000 it would cost for flight lessons by working odd jobs as a photographer, truck driver, and stenographer. That $1,000 would translate to about $12,000 by today's standards. On January 3rd, 1921, Amelia had her first flight lesson at Kinner Field near Long Beach. Amelia dove into her love for flying, cutting her hair short to match other female aviators of the time, and even wearing her treasured leather jacket to bed to create a worn-in look. Nearly 6 months after her first lesson, Amelia purchased a second-hand biplane she nicknamed the Canary due to its bright yellow coloring. Then, in October of 1922, Amelia set her first world record for female pilots by flying to an altitude of 14,000 feet. And less than a year later, she became the 16th woman in the United States to receive a pilot's license. Years later, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh, who you may recognize for more sinister reasons, completed the first solo flight across the Atlantic. There was a scurry to find a female pilot to do the same. Another woman, Amy Guest, expressed interest in the trip, but eventually deemed it too perilous for her to undertake. Instead, Guest offered to sponsor the project and suggested they find another girl with the right image. In April 1928, Amelia received a phone call asking, "Would you like to fly the Atlantic?" In the years following, Amelia completed a number of flights, including her famed solo transatlantic flight in 1932, which made her the first woman to reach this accomplishment. It was at this point that Amelia set her sights on a flight around the world. Although others had attempted and accomplished flights around the world, Amelia's would be the longest at 29,000 miles, following an equatorial route. Amelia's first attempt at the flight around the world was unsuccessful, some sources citing the reasoning for the failure to be pilot error. The aircraft was severely damaged on her first attempt and was shipped away for repairs. But at 39 years old, Amelia set her sights on attempting to circumnavigate the globe again. She was planning on hanging up her spurs, said Susan Butler, author of East to the Dawn. She wasn't planning on doing any more record-setting. Unfortunately, she wouldn't. On June 1st, Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off on her second attempt to circumnavigate the globe, reporting back to the U.S. media every step of the way. On June 29th, the pair reached New Guinea, having already flown 22,000 miles. They had only 7,000 miles to go before reaching their final destination of Oakland, but they would never reach Oakland. On July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan set out for Howard Island, their next refueling stop. Their departure was the last time either of them were seen alive. They lost radio contact with the U.S. Coast Guard, who were anchored off the coast of Howard Island, and disappeared en route. Once learning of the disappearance, current U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a massive search for the pair, spanning 2 weeks' time, but they were never found. On July 19, 1937, the pair were declared lost at sea, and 18 months later, they were both declared dead. But what really happened to Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan? There are many theories and conspiracies surrounding the disappearance of the two famed aviators of old. The official stance of the U.S. government rests on the fact that they crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Earhart's own biography states there is no proof of what happened to her in July of 1937, but bones found on an island in the Pacific Ocean may have belonged to her. I think we have pretty good evidence that it's her, stated anthropologist Richard Jantz. Nevertheless, other theories about the famed pilot have prevailed throughout the years, despite the damning evidence that Amelia's body had in fact been found. According to the crash and sink theory, the plane Amelia was piloting ran out of gas while the pair desperately searched for Howard Island, and they crashed into the open ocean somewhere nearby the island. Over the past 15 years, many expeditions have attempted and failed to locate the wreckage of the plane on the seafloor near the infamous Howard Island. Even with technology such as high-tech sonar and deep-sea robots, there has been no evidence of Amelia's plane, the Electra, being in the vicinity of the island. The Gardner Island hypothesis is postulated by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery and speculates that the pair of aviators took a wrong turn somewhere and landed nearly 400 miles from their original destination on the southwestern Gardner Island. At the time, Gardner Island was completely uninhabited. After Earhart's disappearance, Navy planes flew over Gardner Island and made note there were recent signs of habitation, but no evidence of the plane was ever recovered. The International Group for Historic Aircraft and Recovery maintains that Earhart, and possibly Noonan as well, survived for days or even weeks on the uninhabited island as castaways, before eventually perishing due to a lack of supplies and survival instincts. Since the late 80s, expeditions to the islands have turned up not only artifacts, but also anecdotal evidence that support this hypothesis. Some of the things found include plexiglass that may have come from the Electra, a 1930s-style women's shoe, improvised tools, a cosmetics jar from the 30s, and what appears to be part of a woman's finger. There are, of course, more outlandish theories on the disappearance of the famed pair that have never been sanctioned by any official governing or aviary body. One conspiracy speculates that Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese and executed due to their association with the United States. Another theory says that the pair were not lost at all. The entire disappearance was created as a cover-up by the United States government because the pair functioned as spies for the Roosevelt administration and had assumed new identities upon their return to the United States. In even more bizarre theories, groups have thought that Amelia was rescued by a benevolent people called the Argathians, who lived inside the Earth. It is thought that Amelia is still living with the Argathians inside the hollow Earth as an eternally young version of herself. Others maintain that Amelia was abducted by aliens, a theory that was humorously looked at in Season 2 of Star Trek Voyager, where the crew of the Voyager found Earhart and Noonan stranded on a planet in the Delta Quadrant. Yet another theory states that Amelia faked her own death in order to leave her husband for her navigator, Fred Noonan. And yet another states that the pair crashed because of Noonan's drunken tendencies, though there is no evidence that Noonan had a problem with the drink. And perhaps the most horrifying theory of all is that when the pair crashed on a tiny remote island in the Pacific, they were eaten by giant coconut crabs. Me, though I'm entirely on board with the findings of Richard Jantz of a partial skeleton found in an island in the Pacific, I prefer to think that Amelia and Noonan crashed on the strange island of Sulani, where mermaids both walk the land and swim the sea. The inhabitants look like people, but not the way true humans look, and a volcano awaits its time to erupt and take back the small island of Sulani.